to better support members interested in external examining. So we hope this webinar will feed into that, and watch this space from more from the PSA. We're due to finish in about an hour's time, and there will be time for questions at the end. I'll be moderating the chat, so do post the questions you have there. Please note this session is recorded and make sure that you're muted for now. So without further ado, please welcome Helen.
Thank you, Donna. Hi, everybody. Well done for making it out on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of term. I'm just going to try to make sure that I've shared the right screen with you. So I have a few slides, but they're not very content rich. And basically this presentation arose out of me contacting John and Donna and saying, it seems like the appointment of external examiners in the UK is quite inconsistent, and that it's a lot of tap on the shoulder methods of identifying who to appoint, and that this is quite problematic given what we know about EDI and that kind of making appointments. So in the usual way of things, when you stir things up like that, you create more work for yourself because you then basically volunteer to try to do something about it. So I think that was what instigated this conversation, to try to talk about what the role of external examining is in politics, and what we can do to make it more diverse and inclusive. I've shared the slides in the chat for the session in case it doesn't load on anyone's computer, and I think they're going to put them on the PSA website afterwards, but they do have some Mentimeter polls embedded in them, so I don't know how they'll play out on different people's computer systems. So I thought there were two different aspects to this, and it was kind of instigated by my experience recently of being appointed as an external examiner, combined with my experience being a director of education and student experience in my own department, and our work with external examiners, because one of my jobs is to respond to the reports that our externals submit, and kind of reflecting, what do we do with that information? How do we appoint people? And what the diversity looks like. Because when I sat in our exam board in June, I looked around me and I thought, this is a really white male group of external examiners. And what can we do to try to mitigate that? And actually we recently needed to appoint a new examiner, and we tried to come up with a way to get a more diverse pool of candidates, which we didn't succeed in, because ultimately we fell back on the usual methods of kind of word of mouth and personal networks. So this is about instigating a conversation to talk about how we appoint people and what we expect them to do, and hopefully leading to some better practices within politics. So under rigour, the things that occurred to me, and of course there's other things that might occur to you, are things like what we expect of externals, what processes we use as part of the external examining process, what experiences people have as external examiners. So what do you think, if you are an external, happens to your reports? How do people respond to it? And then of course we know there's also considerable variation in terms of fees, and not just because different courses are wildly different sizes, even studying politics across the UK, but that even when you break it down to an hourly rate, different institutions pay quite different fees to people. On the inclusion side, the things that occurred to me were about the way that we appoint people and increasing the representation of diversity in our pools of examiners. So I dug through some really fun documents to try to come up with an idea of what the established standard is in terms of formal expectations of external examiners. So I looked at the UK Quality Assurance Agency's appendix about external examining and what they expect an external examiner's role to be. And I've just pulled out a few of the things here. I've put links to the documents that I consulted at the end of the slides. So in indicators 1 to 3, the QA outlines what they think an external examiner's role should be, which includes providing informative comment and recommendations on maintaining academic standards, meeting applicable subject benchmark statements, making sure that assessments are rigorous, fair, and assess the program outcomes, and that standards are comparable with other institutions, and to share good practice and recommendations for innovation and learning enhancement. Now, as I mentioned, I'm very new myself to the role of being an external examiner, although I've spent quite a few years now reading our external examiners' reports and trying to draft responses to them. And it seems to me that we probably do some of these things, but maybe we don't do all of these things that the QAA is expecting of us, and that maybe different institutions have different expectations of this. So if anyone happens to have a phone handy, or if you want to go in the browser to menti.com, and I thought it would be interesting to find out what your perceptions are of what the role of externals is in your own departments, and if you have any knowledge of what they do. So if anyone wants to just type in that code, or you can use the QR code to try to respond to a poll and see what people's experience is. Okay, so we've got some results coming in here. So it looks like people consistently, for however many people have responded, feel that externals are providing critical feedback and suggestions for improvement. And this, I would expect, probably does happen in every department. I think that everybody probably understands that externals give comments on stuff, and because we're academics, it's usually critical in some way. And it looks like people fairly consistently feel that they're checking marking schemes and the application of marking criteria. But there are some other areas here that the QA sees as being central to external examining, and it looks like maybe are not quite as common in our own experience within politics. So the lower scores seem to be coming up on ensuring that the curriculum remains current, which the QAA does actually specify is one of the core roles of an external examiner, and checking for the alignment between learning outcomes and QAA subject benchmarks. And to be honest, that doesn't really surprise me. I spend quite a bit of time looking at the QAA subject benchmark, and I'm assuming that the many people from the PSA and BISA who contributed to writing the most recent set of subject benchmarks probably invested a huge amount of time and thought in it, but that it's relatively underutilized within our discipline, especially checking whether our degrees actually reflect what we say we're doing at the degree level and what we have agreed as part of our subject benchmark. And then checking that assessments across modules are of comparable standard, again, seems to be quite consistent. So there are some areas where we do seem to agree that we're all doing, and then there's some areas that are much less consistent, which is probably not surprising. So then what happens to the reports? Because it's not just about what is the role of an external examiner. An external examiner could do a fantastic job, provide really fulsome feedback, but it depends on who you're examining for based on my own word of mouth and discussions that I've had with other people. So some institutions seem to take external examiners' reports more seriously than others. In some institutions, it sounds like what they're looking for is someone who will tick the boxes of fulfilling the QAA requirements, but don't intend to change their practice based on what somebody who's external says. And of course, there's a full gamut in between those two ends. So the QAA says that reports should be available in full to students, which might be a surprise to quite a few people, that the department and the institution, so it particularly says that both the university as a whole and the department should give full and serious consideration to the comments and recommendations, and that student reps should be involved in the process. And for some of you, that might seem like exactly what you do, and for other people, that might feel quite different to what you're doing. So I know, again, reflecting on my own experience of this, we are starting to incorporate students more into the process. We do submit our own external examiners reports to our staff student liaison committee. But at the same time, when we survey our student reps and we say, do you know who our externals are? Have you read any of the reports? Even though we know that they have, because we discussed them at LCF, which is the name of Staff Student Liaison Committee, the reps don't know that much about it. And then, of course, there are other issues of confidentiality that may come up in the reports that we need to be really careful of, in terms of reports that identify particular cases or students where we need to make sure that we're fulfilling GDPR before we share those documents. So I was also curious to ask you, I told you there's lots of crowd participation in this, how seriously you think your department takes feedback from externals. Just again, to get a feel for what level of variation there is in practice. And there is a, I don't know, I'm not involved in this option on there, because it might be that you have a department that takes it seriously, but that the interaction with those reports is not super widespread, so that actually you don't see the processes that go on in the background. So I'll give you a few seconds to try to respond to that one.
Just to say, Helen, that I submitted my response and it doesn't seem to have appeared, so I'm not sure if it's not coming through for some reason.
Okay, it hasn't refreshed then. Try doing the classic go forward and go back again. Okay, so that one's not refreshing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we've got 3 people who say we read the reports carefully and develop an action plan as a response. 1 who's never seen an externals report, and 3 who don't know or aren't involved in this. But it's positive to see that nobody said that they read the reports and reject their conclusions. So it does say that people are willing to engage with the external examiners reports, which is really encouraging. But at the same time, that maybe knowledge of this process isn't widespread, and that maybe colleagues' experiences of external examining in terms of how it affects your own departments might be a bit like our student reps, where it goes on in the background and it does affect practice within the department, but that you might not actually directly see how that affects you. So with my role, for example, we do go through and we develop an action plan in response to the comments that externals submit, but I'm not sure that colleagues would necessarily realize that that's where some of the reforms that we institute have come from. So again, kind of the transparency of what we're doing and why we're doing, and closing that communication loop is not always there. So then we look at one of the ways of improving the rigor of what external examiners do is to talk about the training and expectations. And the Deering report as long ago as 1997 recommended formal training, including a trainee apprentice model for new external examiners, which is also reflected in several of the QAA's documents, where they talk about people who are new to external examining having a mentor-mentee relationship where somebody inducts them into what external examining is like and talks to them about that institution, and that sometimes it might be meaningful to have overlap between two external examiners where the outgoing external actually overlaps with the incoming and kind of passes on their knowledge. I haven't experienced that either in my own institution or elsewhere, and I haven't spoken to anyone who's experienced that as an external. So it's not to say it doesn't happen, but maybe that's not widespread. But maybe unsurprisingly, some research that was commissioned by the QAA and the Higher Education Academy, which is now part of Advanced HE, found few clear patterns emerged in terms of what different external examiners did and how they saw their roles. Where similar constructs were shared, they were interpreted differently, appearing to result in manifestly different standards. Analysis of the overall marks that externals assigned revealed little inter-examiner agreement, and that's not just about the level of the mark that was given, but even agreeing about what classification that mark would fall into. And a number of often contrasting standpoints with regard to what external examining entails and what standards should be used in examining processes. Now, that piece of research was done with 24 experienced external examiners covering 4 different subject areas, I believe. So these weren't people who were super new to the process, but it revealed that there wasn't much agreement or shared expectation of what external examining entails. And maybe this isn't surprising because, for example, within my own department, when we've done marking exercises and kind of alignment of our expectations, we don't really agree with each other, and we have to do quite a bit of work to arrive at a shared expectation, for example, of what a first looks like at level 1, level 2, level 3, and so on. And therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that we don't necessarily agree with each other about what this looks like at the level of external examining, but that maybe we could put a bit more effort into establishing this common ground and making it a bit more explicit, so that if you sign on as an external examiner, or you think I'm interested in being an external examiner, that you have a much better idea of what you're getting into. Because at the moment, it seems like a bit of a black box, that you get a tap on a shoulder from somebody you know who says, hey, do you want to be our external? And you go, yeah, great, because I'm looking for promotion or whatever, or I'm just curious about what other universities do. And then once you get into it, you find out what that university expects of you, which could be a 1-page free text form, or it could be a 15-page structured form. Like, I think ours is now at the point of having 50 separate questions on it. So there's quite a wide gamut in terms of what we're asking people to do. So how are external examiners appointed? So this is turning to the question of inclusion, because what we're told is that if we want to increase the representation of groups who in society have traditionally held less power, we need to advertise things, and we need to do things not by a tap on the shoulder. But in the HEA's own external examiner's handbook, it says institutions rarely advertise for external examiners. Knowledge of the availability of posts relies heavily on word of mouth and networks. They mention a JISC email list that advertises external examining posts, but then they say, however, the most effective way of becoming an external examiner is through networking with discipline colleagues at conferences and meetings, or through links developed in research and teaching, which from an EDI perspective is the worst thing that we could do, because we're not having an open competition. There's no clear pathway of, okay, my institution says I need to be an external examiner as a recognition of esteem before I can apply for promotion to the next level. But the only way of doing this is to be able to contact somebody of sufficient seniority in another institution and ask them if they've got any roles going, or to be known well enough through your own personal networks to be tapped on the shoulder for one of these roles, which from an EDI perspective is really problematic. So next question is, how does your institution appoint external examiners? And I was curious to find out whether there is anyone on this who'd had experience of external examining positions actually being advertised.
Hi again, just to say that I have submitted, so might need a restart.
Yeah, let it refresh in the background. It seems to take a few seconds to register that there's stuff going on that it needs to show. So hopefully it will come up. Anyways, so we'll see whether anyone actually has an institution that does appoint people by an external advert, or whether there's anyone that knows of a different method. It's still not refreshing.
We can always put it in the chat box if it doesn't refresh for some reason.
Yeah, we'll see what it comes up with later. And then the final thing that occurred to me when I was looking around our exam board in June was that almost all of them were white men. And this had never occurred to me before because I hadn't normally sat on exam boards. Normally that would just be our exams officer. But this year, because it was so many extraordinary results and the impact of COVID and so on, we had more people who attended the exam board meeting than would normally do so. So normally I just kind of process the reports that come in and I investigate anything that comes up in them and then I respond to them. And it was only when we were sitting there on the Teams call and you had this kind of panel of people in front of you that you realize that there are many white men in the exam boards. And of course, if external examining is a criterion for promotion, and if we're going to talk about increasing inclusion in our curricula and diversification of the themes and the topics that we cover, then actually the diversity of the external examiners is quite important, because we know that people who have different personal experiences are going to look at our curriculum differently. They're going to look at our assessment differently, and they might bring different critiques or different perspectives or suggestions to what we can do. So actually diversifying our pool of external examiners could be a really important part of achieving greater representation in our curriculum in general. It looks like the general institutional experience is reflective of our discipline, which is more white male than perhaps any other set of characteristics. But we were astonished really when we tried to appoint a woman and we could not immediately find one. So we approached a couple of people. They had what is sometimes a classic female conundrum of already being incredibly overworked, so they turned us down. And in the end, because we needed to appoint someone, the tap on the shoulder went to another white man. But this is what instigated my question of what can we do about this? Can the PSA play some role in, at the very least, coming up with a jobs board or some pool where prospective external examiners can put up their hand and say, I want to be an external, would you consider me? Some way that we can identify people that goes beyond just what our personal networks are. I'm going to go back to that other slide and see whether it wants to refresh for us. There we go. Okay, so nobody who answered that question said that they advertise their role in any way, which is again reflective of what I expected, because I wasn't aware of a common advertising board that anyone uses. So at the end, I've just put some sources and guidance there. And as I said, I've shared the slides in the chat, so you can look through those if you want to see some of the documents that I've quoted from and referred to in the presentation. But mostly I just wanted to start a conversation of what we can do about this.
Thank you, Helen. That was a really useful presentation. It's something that I haven't really, even though I've been an external examiner, it's something I haven't really spent that much time thinking about. It's just something which happens in the background, and these people just kind of turn up and you know, or we just read a report, and that's kind of it really. It's not something that I've thought about that much, but obviously it's something that we all need to think about a bit more, I think, because of the issues that you raise in the presentation. And again, I'm not surprised by the results of many of the polls. I think that it's kind of probably what we'd expect, kind of looking at how the sector works, etc. So as you've been going along, I've kind of gathered up a few questions that kind of come to my mind. So if anyone else has any kind of points or questions, please put them in the chat box. I think what we're really kind of aiming to get is kind of ideas that people have about what the PSA can do. Helen's mentioned about having a kind of jobs board, having a pool of people, etc. So it'd be really good to kind of get your thoughts on if either of those two options would work, or if there are any other options instead that you think would work. Please, put your thoughts in the chat box. But to get things going, I guess one thing which kind of comes to my mind immediately is about how important is it to have discipline-specific external examining training. Obviously, a lot of the stuff which is on offer currently is quite generic. When I was an external examiner at university, there was training, but it was fairly kind of generic rather than kind of policy specific. So I just wonder how important that is, and is there any kind of thing that we need to kind of be aware of, or which would be particularly useful for anything the PSA might offer?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like there are some disciplinary norms. Having read through the HEA and QAA documents, they were very careful not to be too specific, because they were saying this has to apply to everybody. We're trying to pick out commonalities. So I suspect that there would be things that would be discipline specific, that it might be helpful if there were opportunities maybe at the annual conference or whatever, where people could just kind of do a quick refresher, or even exchange of ideas of different externals to meet each other and talk about their experiences at different universities. Because again, this is something where, how do you even identify who those other people are that you can chat to? How do you know who's an external? Can you find somebody who's in your area or who's at a competitor university where you can kind of compare notes? Because if we're going to improve the rigor of what we do, we have to know what we do. And the only way to do that is to talk to each other.
Someone's just said in the chat box that linking to kind of BISA, I guess other organisations too, could potentially be useful. So we kind of reach as broad a pool as possible. I think that's something which would definitely be potentially useful. And I think doing something at the conference, I know we're kind of online next year rather than in person, but even so, we can have a session about, or we could have a session potentially about external examining, kind of best practice, etc. That's something which could potentially work really well. Something else which kind of came to me as you were speaking was about the role of students. I think my institution is fairly ahead of the game in terms of kind of the student voice and getting students involved. I'm aware that other universities probably aren't as far down that road as we are for various reasons. I noticed in your presentation you made the point that reports should be made available in full to students, and also student reps should be involved in the process. I just wondered if you had any advice about how we can do that, how we can kind of make the students more active in that process, perhaps. So rather than them just responding to the report, they're kind of involved at an earlier stage, perhaps.
Maybe you'd be in a better place to share what happens at your institution.
Well, it takes a lot of, we're a sizable institution, which I think helps. So we have structures in place which makes this, perhaps a bit more doable than other places. But I think it's about kind of structuring it across the board, if that makes sense. So it's not just about having students involved in this particular process, it's having students involved in every kind of step of the process. So they're involved in kind of course design, potentially they're involved in assessing courses, they're involved in kind of the review points, etc. So it's about kind of embedding that whole structure, or embedding that process into your overarching structure, which then makes linking to them at this kind of external examining stage a lot easier, because you have the structures in place already, rather than it being an afterthought, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly in a better place than we were 5 years ago, but I wouldn't say that we've cracked it in terms of student involvement. So the fact that we make the reports available, I don't think that means that we necessarily have student input at a really meaningful level where they have a chance to change things. It is a much more reactive role.
I wonder as well what use, I mean, again, I don't know what it's like at your institution, but we have quite a formalized review process at our institution, probably because of the way we have to kind of, the way we kind of write our courses. They're kind of, we have kind of huge VLEs and books, etc., because we're an online university. So we have a review after year one, then we have a review after 5 years, our kind of midpoint review. Our modules tend to run for around kind of 10 years, so they have to kind of be designed in a way which makes that work. So we have these other review points kind of built in, rather than just kind of relying on the kind of external examining stage, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think that helps as well, because it means that you're not just kind of reacting at kind of one point in the cycle. You're kind of you have this kind of review process built in, which is useful. But again, I don't know how much that happens at other universities, or whether it's done on a kind of more informal ad hoc basis.
Yeah, so we just finished our 5-year review, which had really interesting student input, but it's not something we do routinely because it is a huge organizational effort to get all of the students in the room and then process the feedback. We have students who sit on our teaching committee and our curriculum committee, and we are expanding student membership of our routine committees, so now having student reps who sit on our EDI committee as well. And I think that's really important. So we're slowly getting going with this, but I think the fact that students say they don't know who our externals are, even though we've gone through the reports with them, is a fair reflection in terms of not really helping them to understand what external examining is, how it affects their degree, and how it affects our decisions about teaching and assessment.
I think what's kind of coming through to me is this notion of embedding the review process quite kind of formally into kind of ways of working, rather than it being this kind of almost kind of ad hoc afterthought. That seems to be the kind of way to kind of make it successful, whether that's embedding students into the process or embedding regular kind of review points, etc., to kind of make the kind of the curriculum as appropriate as possible. I mean, one of the things which stood out to me in your kind of, I think your first survey was the ensure the curriculum remains current scored, I think, the lowest out of everyone's responses. And again, I just I think it's interesting to think what the external examining role is in relation to that. I think having these regular review points is something which helps with that. But I wondered if you had any other thoughts about kind of what we can do, or what the PSA can do, or what should be done more generally to kind of to work on that kind of benchmark.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple of externals who I'm very happy to say have been pushing us on our curriculum and saying you need to look at your reading list. They're very white male, which is really helpful actually to have that external input, so it's not just me banging a drum, but that actually there's other people saying, okay, this isn't current anymore. You need to actually expand the views that are represented. So that's really helpful. But again, this is kind of based on the external examiner's own experience and their own perspective. And, you know, 2 of them out of, we have 8 or 9 who have mentioned this. So some people don't seem to really be looking carefully at what we're offering, and they're focused much more on the side of, are we assessing consistently, fairly, in keeping with the marking criteria, and much less about what are we teaching? What are we talking about? Is it reflective of the modern discipline?
Someone's just said in the chat box, you know, one other way the PSA could potentially be a benefit is some kind of mentor scheme to kind of, you know, experience to kind of less experienced people, etc., and possibly some kind of funding that departments could apply for to kind of help facilitate that. I've got no, this is all being fed back to the PSA, so I have no idea kind of what will be taken forward, but I think the notion of kind of some kind of mentorship scheme is an interesting one, and also the notion of some kind of training at conference or outside of conference was also mentioned. Would be particularly useful, linking back to the QAA, etc. So I think we've got some kind of good ideas to kind of work on going forward potentially.
And I think it's really important as well to not put the burden of cost on the potential externals, because I know that Advanced AG do run some training sometimes. When I looked at it, it was something like £400 and a day and a half long. Which is going to be prohibitive for most people in terms of both time and money, and would wipe out an entire year's earnings as an external to apply for something like that. So I think doing it in-house has the advantage of, if we can commit to not putting a cost on that.
If all else fails, even if we don't end up doing, you know, running something at conference, you know, it wouldn't actually be that difficult for us to kind of, you know, put resources together, some kind of, obviously we're recording this webinar, but we're kind of more exploring the issues here, but it wouldn't be that difficult to kind of, you know, have a recorded session which people can access, which highlights, you know, some of the key aspects of the role of being an external examiner, links to kind of appropriate benchmarks, some of the kind of key issues to consider before saying yes to being an examiner, etc. That's not, you know, that wouldn't be, you know, particularly difficult to do. We could give it kind of a politics bent as well to kind of make it as appropriate as possible. I know when I became an external examiner, again, I kind of said yes, thinking, well, it's interesting, it's, you know, good for the CV. I couldn't make the actual days. There was actually a day's training I couldn't make because it clashed with other stuff. So I got sent the PowerPoint slides. But they were kind of very kind of high level. There wasn't actually anything really on the day-to-day aspects of what I would actually be doing. So when I actually got the first lot of external examining, I actually was kind of working kind of blind in a way that, you know, I assume this is what they want me to do. There was no kind of mentor or anything like that. I think it worked out okay in the end, but you know, it's quite a daunting thing to do. And also, I don't think there was much. There wasn't really much information about what would then be done with what I was telling them, if that makes sense. So I think that's interesting as well. You know, you spend all this time kind of doing the feedback, and then what do they do with it? I think is a bit of a gap as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I've got one more kind of question before we perhaps wrap up, and that's about kind of what we've talked about, what kind of, you know, the PSA can do, but I think it's also interesting to think about what departments and kind of universities can do more generally, not necessarily about training, but also but more about making colleagues more aware of the external examining process and the actions taken to address the issues. Because I think, you know, there was, you know, some discussion of the notion that, you know, people aren't necessarily aware of what happens with the reports once they've been kind of sent in, etc. So kind of what really can departments and universities do? Is there kind of any best practice that you're aware of or that takes place at your own university?
I mean, I've taken steps, because when I stepped into my role, I was blind. Like, I had no idea that we had these replies and that they affected what we did. So I have tried to compile basically bullet points of things that come out of the reports and to communicate them to staff. But I don't necessarily label that as this came from our external examiners. And I think getting people to think about that, like, how do we communicate this to colleagues when we're in key roles, and that actually it's quite important for inducting early careers academics into what we do, to open that black box and talk about assessment doesn't stop when we finish marking. There are all these other processes that we do afterwards, and it's important to explain to students as well. So sometimes when we get student complaints about marking and we go, well, actually these are the steps that we took after that point when you received the mark, and that usually when we can explain all of these other processes that happen afterwards to check what we're doing and how we responded to them, that then suddenly it becomes so much more transparent, and they don't feel like it's this arbitrary thing that's been handed to them. But yeah, I guess it's about inducting people into these processes and remembering that we probably have to do that every year, because we have new staff and students every year. So just, oh, we did that last year, doesn't mean that they know about it next year.
No, that's really useful. Thank you. I think as we've been going on, I've been kind of making notes about some of the kind of ideas people have put in the chat box, and we've talked about more generally that I will, we can take back to the PSA. The co-chair of the Teaching and Learning Network, John Craig, is kind of leading on this with the PSA. So I'll make sure that he has the information and the feedback that we've got from today. But if anyone has any more thoughts, please do email psateach@psa.ac.uk. We're happy to kind of take any more feedback people have about what we can do in this space to help people interested in being external examiners, etc. We're slightly early, but I think we'll finish it now. I'd like to say thank you, Helen, for such a useful session, and also for demonstrating how the Zoom subtitles work. I haven't used that before, and it actually worked really, really well. So that's something I'm definitely going to bear in mind in the future. This recorded session will appear on our website shortly, and you should get a feedback email as well. Do spread the word about the webinars. They're open to anyone to attend, and obviously we also kind of tweet about the sessions as well, and also link to the recordings and the blogs which result from these sessions. The next session is currently planned for Tuesday the 11th of December at 2 p.m. Or actually maybe that could be, that's Friday the 11th of December at 2 p.m. That's hosted by Victoria Honeyman from Leeds, on the things we gained during lockdown, what we won't miss, and what we should incorporate into our teaching in the longer term. So we hope to see you there. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.